some cool tastings in the pipeline to check out in the not too distant future. And if you're coming to our Fesh Eel at the store Thursday night, we have some one night only ballot opportunities for Lefroy Carchis, Kilholman, Loch Gorm. There's some other stuff. I don't remember. We set some stuff aside. It's going to be a fun night. But if you don't have a ticket, it's too late. Doug, anything you want to add or before we get rolling here?
No, I'm excited. I was up at Anoka last week chatting with Gurpreet, and so he's excited to come down and do that. He'll, I think, be freshly back from a tour over in Japan with
Ooh.
the good folks from the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, so or Calgary
Oh,
Development or something like that. A trade mission of sorts, including some whiskey. So that'll be fun.
I have to say, I've met him twice now. I've heard of him. I've heard a lot of him. I've tried his spirit. It's excellent. I think he's onto something. That guy is a real go-getter. Like, and he seems like he's a bit of a one-man show. He makes the ice outside his distillery for people to skate on. He travels around to sell it. He makes the stuff. He's a recovering lawyer, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's I this might shock you. I like to get nerdy about whiskey sometimes, and this dude puts me to shame on the
Yeah.
nerdy scale. So,
I
cut me about.
I too like to get nerdy, but I also like to keep it fun. And I'm not saying that he doesn't keep it fun. I just that there's a limit to how nerdy I want to get with it. I think is what I'm trying to say. But I love that he has flame stack burners to direct fire his stills. Alberta oil and gas technology repurposed to heat stills and caramelize some of the sugars before they're distilled. Gurpreet will probably tell you all about it if you come to our Canadian Craft Whiskey Festival. Um, yeah, but Glen Garioch. This tasting partly came about because we visited the distillery, and I'm not going to lie, I was really hoping we could convince the distillery manager or visitor center manager, Kat, to host the tasting with us. But there's a time difference. It's been a busy month in Scotland. I mean, she's probably on Isla for Fesh Eel, helping out with the distillery. She's part of the Beam Centauri team. Uh, Doug, when we were over there, we toured some distilleries, including one I used to hold in very high regard that's not far away. Um, that was not as exciting as it was previously. And then Glen Garioch, I think, at least in my opinion, still has a mystique about it, or it revived my curiosity about a place that doesn't get a lot of attention or love.
Well, and it feels like Beam's doing a bunch of work right now. I think trying to get back to a bit more traditional style, increase ferment times. And certainly with Glengarry, they've invested a ton of money over the last couple of years to add in a bunch of stuff like they did Days Yonder. So
Yeah.
go through some of that stuff.
Well, and I think even reverse some of the perhaps bad decisions that were made over the last decade or so. For those who don't know, there's a bit of an interesting story behind Glen Garioch. It is part of what has now been renamed Suntory Global. Suntory is a huge Japanese whiskey company. One of the biggest drinks companies in the world, but it's privately owned. I think people do own shares in it, but it's not a publicly traded company. 15 years ago or so, they purchased, maybe it was 12, they purchased Beam Brands of the States, which is Jim Beam Bourbon, Maker's Mark, Lefroy, Ardmore, Cooley Distillery in Ireland. They bought a bunch of stuff. And I think because they were worried about the optics of a Japanese company purchasing an American one, they decided to make it look like it was a merger and called the company Beam Suntory rather than Suntory or Suntory Brands. And you don't want to offend the Americans. They seem to put Beam in charge of a lot of things. And I remember even going around Bowmore for the last 10 years, people have not been happy about that because they feel that Bowmore has been given much less priority than Lafroig. I think this might have changed a bit after the whole Aston Martin, flirting with cars escapade. But even distilleries like Glen Garioch, there were some changes made. They shortened fermentation times. They made a few other changes. Doug, they didn't stop direct firing or something?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they only just went back to direct firing here in the last year or so with it. But yeah, went into steam coils and shortened ferments and they had 3 stills. They went down to 2 basically.
Yeah. And there was plans to revive the malting floor. I think previously, so Glen Garioch was already part of Suntory, along with Bowmore. They were what was known as Morrison Bowmore Distilleries with Auchentoshan. And they had already started investing money into like restoring the malting floors with an eye to potentially reopening them. And then when the Beam Suntory thing happened, all of these plans seemed to get put on ice. All of these things sort of got slowed down. And I remember it was around this time that I was visiting Lafroig. Even at Lafroig, they had drastically shortened the fermentation. And this is probably about 12, 13 years ago. And I don't know, a lot of these things don't seem to me like the correct decisions. They were made to basically maximize production, not quality. And the interesting thing is when we were over there for our visit in November, and I do have some slides to show, but we'll get into a whiskey before I show any of those. And by slides, of course, I mean the gallery from my Instagram page, because that's how organized I am. They were making it very clear that Suntory was putting more focus back on the quality of the spirit and not on production, which I think is notable. Doug, anything else you think is relevant before we dive into that Glen Garioch 12-year-old?
No, I think I'm excited to dive into a whiskey.
Yeah, I'm sure most people here are. So I'll pull up the page on our site momentarily here. If I can get this to work. What's the date today? 28th. All right, see if Evan's linked. What a guy. He's done it. So Glen Garioch 12-year-old. Here we go. I haven't tried this in ages. I think it is notable to say that this is one of the few single malts under $75 distillery bottled age statement bottlings. And not only that, 48%, which I'm a fan of. You gotta love that. Matured in a mix of bourbon and sherry casks. This is the Glen Garioch 12-year-old from Old Meldrum. And I haven't had this in a while, but some nice malty tones in there. Getting a bit of yogurt too, like maybe a honeyed yogurt. Somewhat reminiscent of like barley malting, like when you pick up barley on the floor while it's going through that germination process and it's converting the starches to sugars. I find it often has a bit of like a yogurt or like a faint yogurty smell to it.
Yeah. Very, very. Yeah, you definitely get that sort of maltiness through it, which is fascinating. A little bit of that creamy. And again, 48%, pretty great value these days for an OB on the shelf.
Well, give it a taste. I think on the palate, still malty. It's still got that sort of yogurty note to it. Nice oak spices creeping in there.
Do we know the cask makeup of that? It feels like there's a bit of sherry in there.
Yeah, it's bourbon and sherry. So we don't know if it's full term maturation or if they finish some of it in sherry, but it does see both bourbon and sherry casks. This whiskey's been around for a while, probably almost as long as I've been in the biz. There was a time when you could buy this for about $30 or $35 a bottle. But I suppose in 20 years, compared to a lot of other things, like 100% inflation over 20 years is probably not the worst, at least by the standards of a lot of other brands that are out there. It's pleasant, it's easy drinking. It comes off a little youthful to me. But it's drinkable. We were talking about the People's Whiskey before, Doug. Could this be the People's Whiskey?
I mean, it's right up there value wise. It feels like with a handful of distilleries these days that are sort of widely
Hmm.
available, and the fact that they still have what I would consider one of the busiest labels as well
Oh,
out there that they haven't updated in quite some time. I mean, it's you got
it
to give credit.
it is there's a lot of print on that label. Uh, I am sure most people would need glasses to read it, but I like the fact that they've got their own bespoke bottle. I like the fact that they haven't rebranded it in at least 15 years. I do remember the old Stag packaging that they used to have. Everybody had Stags back in the day. It was, you want a Highland or a Speyside whiskey, you put a Stag on that thing. That's what the people want. But it does pay homage to the fact, right there on the bottle. What is it, 1797? Glengarioch is one of the oldest distilleries in Scotland. I think it's among like the five or six oldest in the country. And there is some proof, although it's never been tested, that it could be the oldest still operating. It's an unusual distillery because it's right in the heart of a town called Old Meldrum, which is such an incredible name for a town. And it's a bizarre little town too. We spent a bit of, we drove through that town at least 5 times on our tour that took us all over the valley, including to see the farm, the original farm that the founders of the distillery allegedly owned. Um, anyway, it's an old distillery, could be the oldest still operating, but unfortunately, this predates the Small Stills Act. If it was operating as a distillery back then, it was probably illicit. It's not likely that it was above board.
Yeah, no, I think I was reading in one of the malt whiskey yearbooks that back in 1785 there had been a newspaper article in Aberdeen about the stills up and running. So
Really,
certainly there's some proof that it goes back there, but certainly from a licensing perspective, one of the very first.
for
And
sure.
we can get into those very long arguments about the oldest distillery in Scotland. So
Well, and as long as you're not one of those people trying to sell me that the oldest distillery in the world is Bushmills, we're good. But if you are, we're gonna have an argument because that's one I'm prepared to fight. I'm not prepared to let that one go. Uh, if you don't know that story, they make it sound like it's been around since 1608, but it hasn't. It actually dates from, I believe, the early 1800s. Someone in in the county that Bushmills is in, might even be Bushmills County, got a license in 1608, but it wasn't that distillery. So it's a pretty tenuous claim to being the oldest distillery, whiskey distillery in the world. Anyway, couple of quick photos. It's a beautiful little distillery. It's hard to find, if other than the fact that there's really only one road through town. You just have to keep your eye out. It's down a little path, but because it's an urban distillery, it's surrounded by the town. There's some beautiful old stone buildings. There's a view of the valley of the Geary. And this is a part of Scotland. They don't speak, or they never spoke Gaelic up here. They spoke a language called Doric. So they don't pronounce things the way that people in other parts of Scotland do. And Glengarry, as it's spelled, is pronounced Glengarry, or it's the Geary. They have a traditional malting floor, which is back in use. Very cool. Not many distilleries in Scotland with one of those still. Very labor intensive, very expensive to produce floor maltings. There's their old Porteous mill. There's one of the stills. The still room did feel, in retrospect, rather spacious for such an old distillery, but as Doug said, they removed one of their coppers. There's the other. So that'll be the spirit still. The first was the wash still. There's the little spirit safe. And there's the cask of 1979 whiskey. And you can see where I spilt it on the floor as well. It happened. And then they've got this. Well, this actually isn't from the distillery. That's from a place we went for lunch that had, like, it was a 1300 or a 13th century home castle. Doug, does that remember? And this is like a room where you could store your own bottle in it. I'm presuming you have to rent it. But we had a lovely little lunch in a little nook, uh, in a very old building, in a building older than any building still surviving in Canada by a long shot. Yeah, kind of a cool day. Uh,
Meldrum House, which
Meldrum House, that's right.
country hotel and beautiful golf course for any of
Mhm.
those to go in the area. So
I believe they also had some large geese that they were quite proud of. As you do when you have a big estate like that, you need to fill it out. There's probably sheep somewhere.
and the bubble restaurant. There were giant bubble domes out on the
Oh, that's right. Those so hot right now. They've got those out in front of the Fairmont Banff Springs. You can rent it out and have your own private little experience in there. They're one of those COVID things that probably in a place like that where it's raining all the time makes sense. But does it make sense, you know, here? Maybe if they're heated. I probably shouldn't prejudge that, but anyway. We've got some 17-year-old Glen Garioch to dive into next. If you don't have the lineup in front of you, it was in the email. I know Doug put it in the chat for all of you in the waiting room. But I can probably pop it in there one more time. We're going to go on to the Glen Garioch Renaissance, chapter 17. Or sorry, 17-year-old, chapter 3. This is a 15-year-old, distilled in 2014. Blah, 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 blah. There's some confusing things on here. It's yes, it's
15
17.
or 17.
It's 17. They must have re-racked it. Whoever wrote this description, it does not make any sense. We've now reached 17 years and an entire new spectrum of flavors. I think they just cut and pasted this from the Glen Garioch website, and something was lost in translation from Doric to English, I think is what happened here. I'm sure we tried these when we were over there because they're still trying to sell these, even in their parts. I don't even know what the makeup on this is. Whoever did the description should have put something else on there. The ABV, what have we got? We know that it's 50.8%. Doug, well, I'm trying to find more information. What are you getting on this 17-year-old Glen Garioch?
Oh, this is such a step up from the 12, with all due respect to the 12. We're at just over 50%, I think, and just a beautiful creaminess, and yeah, still that sort of underlying sort of malt with a little bit of that sort of honeycomb in the background.
So bourbon and sherry casks is all we know. As with the
Hmm.
I don't remember the exact, and I'm sure Jeff can fact check this or someone, which is partly a challenge, Jeff. I seem to remember these Renaissance bottlings might have had something to do with bringing the floor maltings back, but then they didn't, and then now they have. But I don't remember, and our website doesn't give us that information, so I can't provide any further clarity on it. These are bottlings that have been around for a while. When we get to the 18-year-old, there's a pretty good deal on it at the moment. But Doug, you're saying it smells like bourbon and sherry. It does have a softer approach on the nose for sure.
Slightly higher ABV at just over 50%. Yeah, again, not difficult to go through a couple of glasses of that in the night, and I am happy to get Jeff to fact check things as opposed to Photoshop me into pictures. So we'll put him to work on that. So,
And this has been englassed, as Angus might say, for 7 years. So this has been around for a little while. Is that long enough, Doug, to get a little bottle effect going, or do you need a little longer?
generally, you need a little bit longer. I find it usually takes a couple decades before you do it. I mean, really aging only happens in the cask, but whiskey will still slowly change in
Mhm,
the bottle over a long period of time. But
mhm.
yeah,
It it's quite similar. I mean, it's surprising how similar the 12 and the 18 are, the 17 are, but the 17 is just a step up flavor wise. You're starting to get more fruity tones. The edges are a bit more rounded. It's still very malty. Like this is a very malt forward single malt. Lots of grain, nice minerality to it too. You're starting to see some like richer like chocolate tones come out. The fruits are also starting to be a bit more bright, bit more exotic.
I don't know.
Hmm.
Jeff GPT is the ultimate fact checker, I feel like, on some of these things, and it
I believe
scares
it's, just to be fair, I believe it's Chat Jeff PT
Oh,
is
there
the
we go.
nomenclature that we've settled on, although he's renamed himself once more. Yeah, it's very pleasant. 50.8%. It's no rough edges. It's a little bit warm, I think, on the palate. Um, I don't know. To me, that tastes like I would have liked to see that after another 5 or 6 years. Like it's on the road to greatness, but it's not quite there yet.
Yeah, it feels like there was probably a decent parcel of second and third fill bourbon, sort of barrels in there where you know it was waiting to sort of get a bit more tropical fruit notes added to it in the next couple of years.
I
Excited to see
mean,
the progress.
you mentioned that, Doug, but it's starting to go tropical. Like you're starting to see some like pineapple coming off of it. Um, yeah, again, would like to see a bit more development out of it. Now, there might be some good news on this. I'm actually going to just quickly log in and see if I can find out. Um, they did recently drop the price dramatically on the next bottling that we're going to try. Uh, there's a chance that this one is going to go on sale as well too. Um, but I'm going to know in a moment. Nope, no, it's not. So the price is the price. We can still get it. It's still available. So Peter was asking what the price on it is. Pricing is 175, and I'm sure we'll have it back in stock at some point in time here. But let's reserve excitement about the 17-year-old until we try the 18, because the 18 is at present a bit of a screaming deal. It was 210. It's on for 126 at the moment, which I think is something like 40% off. So pretty big discounts on that one. What do we know about the chapter 4 of the Glen Garioch Renaissance series? It's an 18-year-old, ex-bourbon and sherry casks. And all of this was meant to exemplify the distillery's newish house style as of 1997. So that ties into Jeff's comment. It also comments on, or is a reference to the fact that Glen Garioch was acquired by, our description says Beam Suntory, but really it was by Morrison Bowmore Distillers, who were then acquired by uh, Suntory a little bit later on.
So,
Doug, go ahead.
question. Well, first of all, I just had a quick sip of it, and again, those fruity notes coming through. I mean, my biggest question, and this is probably getting a little nitpicky, is it says it's the fourth chapter of a four-part series. So
Mhm.
is this the final chapter and part, or is this only the first part and a fourth chapter? I'm so confused right now.
Are you wondering if they're going to Star Wars this thing and like
Is it
some
does
prequels?
currently own the rights, and we're going to see 4 or 5 of these out every year now on Disney Plus.
What do you call the last three movies? Is that a postquel? Like, is that a thing or not?
I'm scared to even go down that rabbit hole. I feel like we could probably spend far too much of the night talking about that.
We could. Semantics, as some might say. Um,
Sammy, Sammy's got an update for us here. This is an 18-year-old culmination of the story that began with the 15, 16, 17-year-old expressions.
hmm.
So, rightfully so, these were probably all distilled in 97 when ultimately the distillery restarted.
For some reason, I'm worried the math on that doesn't fully line up. Because the last one was a 17-year-old from 2007, or sorry, 2017. So the vintage on it, unless they have liquid that's even older in it, if it's not a vintage product, maybe that would make sense. But like 2017 less 17 is 2000. So maybe they had a concept and then they just didn't run with it, but they kept the chapter bit going.
it wouldn't be the first time that the marketing folks won out against logic on one of these things. And as usual, your math skills are impeccable, sir. So
Um, basic addition and subtraction are my skill set. Anything above that, I rely on people with more patience and patience, yeah, to do such things. Um, it seems more like perfumed on the nose to me. Like
yeah,
it's almost going into like potpourri notes. Dare I even say perhaps like lavender or a bit of lilac?
I was just going to say there's a bit more of a floral note, and it feels like there's a bit more sherry in this one as well.
Mhm.
There's a bit slightly more rich, certainly more creamy, and a little bit more floral, it feels like.
Now we're talking.
Yeah.
Um,
And for that price, I mean, it's a smoking deal, I'm not going to lie. So
I think 126 is a very fair price for this product.
yeah.
Quality wise, flavor profile wise. It's got a nice mouthfeel to it. We've kept the ABV up 50.2%. Um, it's one of the funny things about this, Doug, is I'm not even sure all four chapters came to Alberta or even Canada. Um, I have a vague recollection that we only got 2, 3, and 4.
Hmm.
And inevitably, what happens with a lot of these things is they bring in most of it to Alberta, but then they also try to sell it in Ontario, Quebec, and BC. And when those markets can't sell it all, they then just dump the rest back into Alberta, which is why this is still here like 5, 6 years later, and why it's now getting big time discounted just to keep it churning through the inventory.
Well, there's only two winners in that story, my friend. That is the consumers with a great price and AGLC charging an arm and a leg for storage in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I mean, those two things are now directly tied because the companies, for those who don't know, companies that have products, I believe that retail for or wholesale for under $100, I think it predominantly affects them that have been in the market for more than a year. Your storage fees go up like substantially. And it's actually, I think, caused a couple of agencies to fold because first of all, things slowed down. Now they're also paying these higher fees, and it's no bueno, it would seem. But I think that's great. And to be honest, it seems to me, to my taste, like a lot better than the 17. So
I would agree that the 18, I think, is my favorite of the three so far. But again,
yeah.
all of them are very, very reasonable and solid drams.
All right. Well, now let's go on to something a little different. Glen Garioch Virgin Oak Chapter 2. It's actually not Chapter 2, it's number 2. I just I threw the chapter in there because I would give it a bit of synergy, I think. Uh, so this is bottled at 48%. I'm assuming this is virgin American oak, but let's find out. We don't have that on our site. It's a small batch, released 2019, and virgin North American white oak casks. So
There you go.
no age on it, no indication of how old it is, but this is another whiskey that's been in the market for about 5, 6 years. One of the other things that's worth mentioning is that sometimes in big importers like Suntory will overprice things in Alberta. I know that might cause a few of you to get a little angry. It causes me to get a little angry from time to time. But the reason they do that is because they're planning to list these products in Ontario, Quebec, and BC as well. Those markets, which take huge percentages, don't want to be drastically more expensive than Alberta. And so what they do is they monkey with our wholesales here, which pushes the price too high, and then things don't sell, and then they have to discount them, which is a partial explanation for why that Glen Garioch 18 is on such a big discount now. Uh, I don't remember even trying this before. Maybe I've tried it, maybe I haven't, but Virgin Oak can be overdone very, very quickly. Doug, what are the thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, there's definitely an much more predominant oak note to this than what we saw with the other ones.
Mm,
Uh, I don't mean this as disrespectful. It almost reminds me of Shelter Point and some of their virgin oak releases where there's a real predominance, and I wonder if there's a heavy sort of toasting, even though there might not be a char or anything else or medium char associated with it, because it certainly feels like we're getting into some heavy wood influence territory.
Yeah. I'm getting two distinct notes here. One of them is peanut brittle, which, I mean, the chances are that this is probably the same wood supplier that supplies Jim Beam, because the companies are linked. And I always get peanut notes from Jim Beam, even though these aren't Jim Beam bourbon barrels. Maybe they're casks that were toasted to Jim Beam's specifications. But I'm also getting, and bear with me on this one, and I think it ties into the note about the lavender and lilacs before. I'm getting like bubble bath and rubber ducks on this one.
I'm getting sort of an oat cake in a sort of eating oat cakes in like a farmer's field where there's a little bit of floral notes in the air. There's a little bit of that sort of like farmy, almost manure like sort of notes in the background with it, but very sort of strong oat cake note, which is interesting.
See that? I can even get like, Doug, I don't know if the French eat oat cakes as well too, but there's like this Armagnac farmy grape note that came from that. I'm
Oh,
also getting non-food safe plastic, by which I mean like soft, plastic that things come in that you're kind of like, I don't know that I want to put anything that touch that, or, into my mouth or hold it. So
oh,
that might be
microplastic.
that rubber duck note.
Yeah. Just as a quick side note on the whole virgin oak discussion, my last trip over a couple weeks ago into Scotland, there's a lot more producers starting to use European virgin oak because the cask expenses go up so much when you're seasoning with sherry and everything else. But quite a difference between the European virgin versus the American. But I see you smiling. So are Sammy and Jeff up to no good in the chat? I haven't seen.
No, but I mean, I liked your comment. And then also I was smiling partly because I find the palate on this more pleasant than I was expecting. It's not overly complex, but it's very pleasant. I mean, it's soft. I think that virgin oak has really toned down the malt. Um, and yeah, it's easy drinking. It's fun. I don't like it as much as the 18, but I liked it a lot. I thought I was going to dislike it. No, Tom Rand asked the question. At some point, can you explain the tasting, why the tasting whiskey is for closers theme and movie poster? Tom, we like to have fun. We like to joke around a little bit. And for a long time in my head, I've had like Glen Garioch Glen Rothes bouncing around as a tasting idea. And Evan and I came up with this idea, and we thought we could do it, but I didn't want to do a 50-50 Glen Garioch Glen Rothes tasting, because I don't know that I could find that many Glen Rothes that I'm that excited to put four of them into a tasting. So there's only one Glen Rothes, simply so we could call the tasting Glen Garioch Glen Rothes, based on the movie that Alec Baldwin was in, where at some point in the movie he famously says, "Coffee is for closers." And like, what happens to go something like, first prize is like money, second prize is like a a coffee cup, third prize is you're fired. So we had some fun. We riffed off it a little bit. We did use AI to manipulate and create our own poster, but tried to keep it different enough so as not to get sued. Um, and
Oh,
we're not going to show any clips of Glen Garioch Glen Rothes during the tasting, because we learned once before when we do that YouTube will block our content. So we can't do that. But
uh-oh.
what we could have done if we were more organized, Doug, is you and I could have rehearsed a scene and performed it for everybody, but we didn't. So
Well, I'm excited. Sora from Chat Jeff PT is coming out later this fall, so we can start creating our own movies of here shortly, theoretically, which will both be exciting and potentially the downfall of society. So
yeah, I think we're in trouble. But Anyway, what are you gonna do? Just find a good bottle of whiskey and enjoy the ride as
Exactly.
long as you can. Uh, well, that takes us to the end of the core range. I don't even know core ranges of the official bottlings of Glengarry that we have for tonight's tasting. I do remember a time not too long ago, probably about 14 years ago, when you could still get Glengarry 21 for around $100. Came in a fake leather box back when fake leather boxes were very trendy and on point. Terrible for, I mean, you can't recycle anything on those old whiskey boxes, and they were very, very fragile. But great value whiskey. Glengarry is a whiskey that I really feel improves a lot with age. I think that maltiness that we're seeing in some of the younger ones, it just needs time to mellow, settle down, get built upon. Now we're on to something a little different. We are on to a whiskey sponge bottling of Glengarry that is quite interesting. And one of the things I love about this bottling is that it was matured initially for 10 years in refill hogsheads, and then it was finished for 20 years in first fill port barriques, which is quite unusual. So it begs the question, is it still finishing if it spent 2/3 of its life in the finishing cask?
I have an opinion about this.
Doug, let's hear it. I'm
Because
excited to hear this.
so you need 3 years in cask in order to call it whiskey. So 3 years or less, in my opinion, it's a finish. 3 years or more, and it's a secondary maturation.
Okay, I like it. Like it. It's good criteria. This is on sale. I'm not really sure why. But there's only a bottle or two of it left, I think. So if it's something of interest to you, you might want to jump on it. 30-year-old Glengarry, 41.4%, natural cask strength. Now, the sponge has a pretty good sense of humor about many things. Uh, I'm sure he said something clever here. A delicious and very silly whiskey that would probably be enjoyed while wearing extremely comfortable slippers within a radius of no more than 10 meters of a modest log fire. I mean, that sounds very pleasant. It's not as cheeky as I might have expected it to be, though.
Well, we're in the final throes of Whiskey Sponge, because he said after release 100, he's going to be changing things up quite a bit, which will be interesting to see. But man, I think Sammy was absolutely right in this, that we've really turned the corner or changed gears with this one, where we're just in a huge amount of richness and sweetness. Even with the lower ABV, it stands up very well to all of the others.
This is a very old school style whiskey too on the nose. It smells antique. It smells old and musty. Um, Katie was commenting here about the Whiskey Sponge brand and $800 don't seem to go together. Well, Katie, I've got news for you. I've got a $2,000+ Whiskey Sponge Moss Towie in the shop. And I would even say the label doesn't look like a $2,000+ label, but that's not what the sponge is about. The sponge is about taking playful shots at the industry. Even on this one here, he's appears to be kicking a star, which I don't know if is like a reference to like whiskey reviews or something, as if it's a soccer ball kicking it down the street. Um, yeah, the brand, this is part of Decadent Drinks, as Doug said. The Whiskey Sponge bottlings are going to come to an end in the not too distant future. We've been fortunate to do one through the store. The labels are generally kind of silly or an inside joke. But this, I think, was meant to be more kind of classic and old school, because the profile on this whiskey is very classic and very old school.
Mm. The palate is just massive for 41.4% for me. Super sweet and rich, and I can only imagine what that would have been like a couple years ago at a higher ABV.
So much leather, so much chocolate, so much like berry fruit, dark fruit, um, and silky. And it still has that nice little bit of like a musty, earthy, dunnagey tone to it. Baker's chocolate. I mean, there's a lot going on there. It's interesting because I think, I agree with you. Like for how low the ABV is. I mean, this is perilously low. You can lose 1% of strength taking the whiskey from the tanker it's in, or the what is it, the IPC, and putting it in through the bottling line into bottles. You can lose a full percentage of strength just doing that. And yeah, I mean, once you're below 40, it's not legally whiskey anymore,
Yeah.
unless you blend it with something above strength. And then if that's younger, you don't have a 30-year-old whiskey anymore.
You have a 30-year-old spirit drink
Mhm.
at that point. Katie's asking, what's the wood taste in this? Is it pine?
It's from the port casks. So port casks, and this is something that's sort of fun to reflect on for a moment. You get two types of port casks used in whiskey. You have tawny port casks, which are casks used to mature port for very long periods of time. And generally in those, you're not going to get a lot of character or color. Um, there's a good chance this is an old tawny cask, because you're mostly getting oxidation and a little bit of maybe residual grape from those outer layers of the inside of the cask. The other type is ruby port, and typically when you see those used for whiskey, you get something a little pinker. I would say that the grapey tones are a little bit more obvious. It's even more chocolatey. Um, but yeah, the casking on this that's influencing it is the port cask. Uh, I'm very port cask skeptical. I generally don't love port casks. There are some though that I think really work, and in this case, I think it does really work. But a lot of port casks are just they're too sort of one-dimensional, and they're too uh
They can overwhelm the whiskey quite quickly.
yeah, exactly.
Well, and it's interesting. I think you were telling me this a couple years ago. You had done a trip to Portugal, and we don't see too much port because generally,
Yeah.
sherry and bourbon, you're dumping those casks off to the whiskey industry fairly quickly. Whereas with the port casks, they're using them until they're literally almost falling apart, I think, and then shipping them off.
Yeah, so and I mean, if they're shipping them off at all, like this, the best port houses, places like Fonseca, Taylor Fladgate, they don't replace casks, and they'll use these casks for a century or more. They replace staves. So if a cask is leaking, they'll figure out which stave is bad and they'll replace that one stave and then tighten the cask back up. So they were all surprised because I was asking them, like, do you sell your cask to the whiskey industry? And no one, not a single one of the best port houses said yes, which tells me that it's really the entry level, the ruby ports, the really cheap, dirty, the LBVs, the inexpensive ports. Those are the ones that are being used to season casks that are then getting used for Scotch maturation. So casks like this to me, which are, is 20 years old, as 20 years ago this cask was being used. This is going back to a period where maybe they were getting actual old school tawny casks as opposed to ruby or LBV casks. Yes, Sammy, when you take the stave out, you have to take the ends off, you have to loosen the hoops and basically rebuild it. I mean, but that's what these places do. And to add to the comment, and Doug, I'm glad you brought that story up, because there's a reason why they do that, why they reuse the wood. It's because they're not looking for the wood to add anything to the wine. The wood's not there to give toasty notes or spices like in a buttery Chardonnay. The wood is there to be a vessel for oxidation. They want to put this intensely fruity, very sweet wine into the cask and let it oxidize for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So they don't want the wood to impart anything on the flavor. They just want that oak there to be allow the air to get slowly in and out of the cask and influence the maturation of the wine. So cool, release, fun. Next up, some 31-year-old Glen Garioch. Something a little different this time. This is part of the Elixir Distillers Macbeth collection range. For those of you who didn't previously see it, Elixir Distillers did a range of whiskeys inspired by Shakespeare's play Macbeth. I believe there's 42 total whiskeys to be released over a period of 5 or 6 years in 4 acts. We've only just received Act 1. And in my opinion, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this tasting. One of the highlights of that entire tasting was the Macbeth Glen Garioch 31-year-old. This was matured in American oak first fill ex-bourbon barrels for 31 years and bottled at 54.6%. Now, the interesting thing about all these Macbeth releases, if you find it interesting, is that the whiskeys were selected to be representative of characters from the play. So they did not start with whiskeys that they wanted to bottle. They started with characters, and then they went out and found whiskeys that exemplified each character. This one is Angus, one of the Thanes who switches allegiance from Macbeth to Malcolm. And what else do they say here? You can taste the weight of the spirit. Florals, spices are balanced and tempered by the unctuous mouthfeel. I wrote a tasting note up on this. Dave Broom was part of this project, but his tasting notes are so esoteric and English literature-esque that they're bordering on useless. Nice chap though he is. And this is an interesting concept. I think it was a huge hit in the UK. I don't know that Shakespeare and whiskey have as much synergy in Canada as perhaps they do in Scotland and England.
Well, I remember when we were over at Whiskey Live Paris at the end of last year, we were able to pop over to the booth and they had a bunch of these to try. And I remember this being the star of the show for that portion of it. And I mean, this is a pretty spectacular nose and palate, I have to say. And again, just very quite the contrast from the last one, where you had a very rich and sweet sort of whiskey comparatively to this, which is
Mhm.
has a lovely complexity to it.
This is a more like, I mean, it's the oak is still quite prominent. I mean, these were first fill ex bourbon barrels, but they're not so, the weight of them is not so great that it hasn't allowed the spirit to become, very tropical and softer and really round out the edges. Um, I do want to just kind of showcase the set for a second while folks are nosing this one. So this is the first 9 bottlings that came out in it. Each of them has the sketch of a character from Macbeth, all of them birds. The artist who designed these, Sir Quentin Blake, was initially not interested in the project at all. And then I guess as you do when you're in your 70s and find inspiration, he basically just stayed up one night and drew every single character in about a 5 to 6 hour period. And that's it. Job well done. Uh, his work was complete. They still haven't found the liquid for all the upcoming releases. They're trying to piece it together bit by bit over time. But this Glen Garioch, along with I think the Linkwood, were my 2 favorites from that release.
Yeah, quite beautiful with it. And it'll be interesting to see what they put in. So I'm guessing, so there's 9 bottles in this set. So I'm assuming there's 5 series altogether. Am I right?
It's well, how many acts are in Macbeth? Is it 4 or 5? Was there always 4, or are there 5 acts?
Uh,
Jeff PT, we need an answer to this. How many acts in Macbeth? Uh, cough syrup on the palate, Peter.
there's a lovely, oh, Jeff says 5. Okay, there we go.
You win, Doug. You win.
I-
Oh man,
yeah.
that is like, it's tropical fruit punch on the palate.
But there's still a beautiful richness and creaminess that you still get with a bourbon barrel. And it's fascinating to me that this is a first fill and that you don't have oak that's completely dominating this. This just seems like such a lovely balance, all things considered.
It would be very easy for this to be way over the top, way too heavily oaked. It's not. Yeah, that it's got that sort of vanilla cupcake icing sort of sweetness to it. It's creamy, but Man, to me, this is mangoes, papayas, kiwis. It's just a tropical fruit bowl.
Yeah, and there's almost a little bit of like honeysuckle or like slightest of floral notes in there. With
Lilacs, if you will.
absolutely beautiful. So
It seems all of Shakespeare's plays had 5 acts, which is an interesting fact. Joke's on you, Jeff. I did not like English literature. Not a fan. I mean, it's not that I didn't like. It's just when you're in, like, how many people actually liked reading Shakespeare when they were teenagers? I would imagine not many. Um, if they had, like, you know, dressed it up for our generation, um, maybe it would have been, made it more relevant to us. But I do want to comment though, and I do this every chance I get the opportunity, because what I did love was history, and it turns out Shakespeare may have been a little less than kind and fair to the actual historical king, Macbeth, who was a king of much of Scotland. He's also buried on the Holy Isle of Iona. One other useless fact: more European monarchs are buried on the island of Iona, which is a 1 by 3 mile island off the coast of the island of Mull, than anywhere else in Europe. Um, Fascinating little fact there for you. But yeah, Macbeth was not such a bad dude as Shakespeare would have you believe. But the Scots have been saying this about the English forever. They're always making up horrible lies about them, I believe would be their telling of things.
well, the chat has never been more feisty than talking about Shakespeare right now.
Mm.
So I'll give full credit to getting everybody going and shout out to Tom who still put up his hand and owned loving a good Shakespeare
Well,
play.
there you go. I'm glad someone really, really liked a good Shakespeare. I did watch the one with what's his name?
Leonardo?
No, I mean, no, the uh what other movies was he in? He was in Glory. He was the soldier in Glory, African American actor, incredible actor. He did Macbeth, I'm quite sure, and it was incredible. Someone will pull this up here. Denzel Washington, that's the one. Great actor. Pretty sure he did a wonderful. At least that's I'm remembering it that way. Hopefully, I'm not off base on that, but who knows?
Well, an absolutely beautiful whiskey, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm actually quite enthralled with the camera work on Shannon C slash Shannon One's camera, where we're getting zoom ins and zoom outs as they're going. The
Oh,
iPad, I
they're
feel
like
like
doing this.
no. I think I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that they're on an iPad. So when one comes
Oh,
in under the pad, it auto zooms in and out. It's
that is some
technology forward. So
fancy technology. My parents need that one because they're always like face right up at the thing because they've got an old iPad and they're trying to watch it. Um, Technology it's pretty incredible. So I was right. Tragedy of Macbeth, Denzel Washington, 2021. It was gripping, even though I still didn't understand a lot of the words that were being said. But hell of an actor. One last Glen Garioch to go through. This one's a fun little surprise because this is a Scotch Malt Whisky Society bottling that's not even available yet. Which is not to say that it's not in market. It is, but it's not going to be released in Canada until I believe the fall. So this is Scotch Malt Whisky Society 19.53. It's totally fanciful is the name. It's an 18-year-old from a first fill ex bourbon barrel. So right off the bat there, you've totally got my attention. The SMWS notes, well, I won't read that off the bat, but this is a pre-release of Society Glengarry. They've had some lovely Glengarries in the last couple years after a very long drought, and it's got a nice nose.
yeah, no, it's when we first poured it, I was giving it a nose and it was very, very malty. But it feels like a little bit of oxygen has really been able to um I know I'm gonna trigger you as much as talking about whiskey stones or some of these other things, but it's opened up quite a bit and
Mm.
there's creamy, sort of honeyed, sort of bourbony first fill bourbon note to the nose at least now.
Yeah, again, another first fill bourbon barrel, still very malty. You didn't trigger me because I don't believe you added water to open it up, or did you?
No, I did not. No water around these parts.
Not that I would begrudge anyone from adding water, but just don't add water and tell me it opened it up, or that
No.
it always opens it up.
Or add whiskey stones where you're doing the worst of all worlds, so you're not diluting it down to create a different chemical profile, but you're literally chilling it so that you're losing as much flavor as possible.
And you could chip your teeth on them. And I mean, dental health is so important in life. Like it's tied into heart health and so many other things. So whiskey stone's bad, I guess is
And
what I'm trying to say.
one of my all-time favorite Christmases was the year that I bought you a pack of whiskey stones just to troll you a little bit and see your reaction. So
It's funny. I used to love when people like brand ambassadors would be in town to be like, oh, and I got a little something for you. They're like, here you go. And I'm trying to be like, I don't know. I almost immediately lose a little respect for them. Like I appreciate the fact that they wanted to give me some sort of branded gift, but like it's I mean, I used to add them to beer. I'd call them beer stones because they kept my beer cold. But then I found that it like affected the flavor. Like I think it caused like a pH change in the beer, especially if they were those granite ones. Um, and then the metal ones, like who knows what those are made of. So
mm, mm, mm. Oh yeah, I love that one. That's just beautiful. Classic first fill bourbon, 18 years old, 59.2%. I mean, you've got to warm your palate up a little bit to get there, but
not sharp, it's not rough though. I mean,
no, no.
if anything to me, this is like the Macbeth 31, but just not quite as fruity and with a little bit of a rougher, more peasant-like demeanor, you know?
Well, here's a question for you. So you've got a 31-year-old whiskey that we had in the last one at 54.5%. We've got this one, 18 years old at 59.2%. Are they finding super tight casks and putting it at 63.5%? Or are they filling at a 68% level or something else like that, do you think?
I to be honest, I think that these are probably just really well made bourbon casks and that this is, you know, they're put in the warehouse, they're not moved. Uh, I highly doubt that these are like 68. I don't think a lot of distilleries were doing this. And I don't think they were doing that 20 years ago. They've definitely been doing it in the last 15 or so. But I would say in the period before that, they probably weren't doing that. I don't think there was a shortage of oak around the late 90s, early 2000s. There was by the late 2000s. And certainly that's when I think a lot of distilleries, like you said, with Tormore, started filling at a higher proof so that they're filling less casks. But I would expect these are probably just, you
Yeah.
know, casks that held their strength well.
Well, it's interesting that we're actually talking about higher proof. It wasn't meant to be, but it's actually a great roll into our last whiskey, which does fill at 68.5% for almost all of their casks.
And interesting side note, I didn't know this. I was looking into things not open to the public. It
Mhm.
used to be through Berry Brothers and Red back in their stage. So we are now segueing away from Glen Geary to Glenrothes. This is the whiskey that we put into the tasting simply so we could call this the Glen Geary Glenrothes tasting. Um, it's a signatory Glenrothes, so I have medium high hopes. But Glenrothes and sherry, for me, can be extremely hit or miss. Uh, I do have an interesting note right off the bat on this one, though. Boursin, you know that cheese with like herbs and onions, and French onion soup. Those are
Yeah.
the two things that are coming off the nose on this right off the bat. And yes, Jeff, this
Yeah,
is.
that French onion soup.
Oh, you cut out there for a second, Doug.
Oh,
But yeah, that
yes,
Boursin note
totally
there.
get.
You totally get what? Oh, Doug has frozen. I might have lost him. Maybe he'll come back. On the palate, I mean, it's not dreadful. It's very meaty. Lots of kind of like cooked onions. There's like a baked turnip thing there too. It's interesting. This is quite a meaty Glenrothes, and it's because Chris and Sarah, that is not Glengarioch. No, this is definitely not Glengarioch. And sour cream and onion chips, I would buy that if it like maybe somehow they went off. Like it was like sour cream and onion chips that somehow went bad. Uh, to your point or question, Peter, yes, cheese can be a good thing in certain contexts. You know, the interesting thing is I don't like the nose on this, but I don't mind the palate. The palate's interesting. It's decent. Is this something that I would ever get excited about? Probably not, if I'm being fair. But for $138, it's not a terrible bottling of Glenrothes. Matured in first fill Oloroso and bourbon for 12 years, bottled as part of the Signatory vintage small batch range. This is a new range of whiskeys. This was also a good opportunity to throw this into a tasting. Anyway, Doug, if you're back, do you have any thoughts on this one you want to share?
Yeah, I would agree. I think we're at that point of the night where my wife and children are all streaming high definition.
Oh.
So apologies for the internet.
I mean, there's only so much minions that can be crammed down one like Ethernet cable connection. So, uh, well, any other thoughts on the Rothes before we go and do a little speed round here? Is this one of those if you have nothing nice to say nothing at all situations?
Well, it's fun that we found Glenrothes displayed in 2 words at the very least to go with the
Yeah.
theme.
I mean, I would have to say this has got to be symptomatic. And if you don't know what Doug's referring to, it's the label. Um, this must be the effect of the Germans taking a majority stake in Signatory and probably control. But yeah, this should be 1 word. It is definitely not 2 words, but a fun little typo, and it worked out appropriately for tonight's tasting. Jeff saying, I think this might smell or sell better if people haven't tried it first. Uh, not being loved by a lot of people. I'll admit I don't think it's dreadful, but I know that's also damning something with faint praise. Uh, all right, we're going to start the speed round. Doug will join us when he's able. Peter's saying too cheesy. All right, Glen Garioch 12-year actually has opened up kind of nicely on the nose over time. It's creamy, malty, fruity on the nose. It has improved with time.
Agreed.
Palate's still a little on the rough side for my take, but if the people like it, it's a good price, good value. All right, Glen Garioch Renaissance Chapter 3, 17-year-old. It's very floral now.
Hmm.
It's like a stepped up version of the 12. I mean, they're kind of in lockstep.
Yeah, I think you're right in that.
Yeah, pretty good. Sammy saying $68 for a 12-year-old is quite good, especially when it holds up after a few cast strength drams and after a few pushing 30 years of age to boot. All right, what about that 18-year-old, Chapter 4?
Yeah, I think that that's probably still the winner of the 3 for me, although I think Sammy's absolutely right for the value for money. The 18 is an amazing price, and the 12 is as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it drinks really well. It's got a nice balanced palate to it, nice flavors. Digging that. Tom, to answer your question, it opened up due to oxidation. That's what opened it up. Time in the glass, exposure to oxygen. That's where some whiskeys will improve with a bit of breathing. Not to go down a rabbit hole here, but I've opened bottles before where it took a month before they were drinking at their best. And then bizarrely, some of them would start to taper off. They would get not as good. The problem is most humans, especially humans with vast collections of things open because they're curious, rarely can consume things in the best amount of time possible for many reasons. But not, it's like wine. There's peaks and troughs, but every whiskey's a little different in how it oxidizes.
Well, oxygen is ultimately the thing that keeps us alive and is slowly killing us all at the same time. So
It's a double-edged sword if ever there was one. Virgin oak. I mean, it's still okay, but
much more orangey for me now than it was the
Mhm.
first.
Yeah, creamsicle, orange starburst.
Yeah.
It's got a nice velvety palate to it, but I mean, it's kind of the like the bourbon drinker's scotch, if ever there was one. Like it's got a very narrow focused flavor profile, which I think is a dig at bourbon, but um, you know, a backhanded dig. Uh, whiskey sponge, Glen Garioch.
The nose is so light comparatively now, I feel like, to some of the other ones.
It is, but it's also, I mean, this reminds me of like really old cognac, like very fleshy fruit. It reminds me of like a really good apple crumble with lots of cinnamon and lots of brown sugar.
I mean, this ABV, I find whiskeys like this have such a narrow window where they're sort of at their peak before they start sort of trailing off a little bit. But still lovely whiskey, I think.
It's on the cusp of greatness, just a shade off of it. But man, that's a great dram. 31-year-old Macbeth. Angus, the Angus bottling.
The birthplace of Scotland in Angus.
Mm.
Oh,
Is that where they
how
could
do you
never
not
take
love
their
that?
freedom? No?
I honestly, I was driving between Aberdeen and Edinburgh, and I drove by a place called Angus, and they said it was the birthplace of Scotland. I have no idea what the story is, but the uh the advertising got me.
Mm. I mean, what's it called? The battlefield near Stirling, where the William Wallace and Robert the Bruce got the English on the wrong side of the creek and had their way with them. Um, doesn't matter. It'll come to me at another time. I really like that Macbeth Glengarry. That's a great bottle. Uh, Scotch malt whiskey society, Bannockburn. There you go. Spelt incorrectly,
Here
but
we go.
got the right word. Uh,
Mm.
man, that it's very fresh but farmy at the same time. Like it's spearmint gum meets horse trampled hay.
I can't wait to now that they're floor malty, now they're direct firing their stills. 35% of their malt is coming from the floor now. I'm super excited to see what some of this, how this distillate's going to evolve in the coming decade or two, and we start getting access to some of these early 90s malts versus some of the modern stuff.
It will indeed be interesting to see how it changes. All right. And now for the Monty Python of drams in tonight's range. Oh man.
That is completely different, isn't it?
It's like a French restaurant. I'm getting like snails cooked in butter with like garlic, the boursin, the French onion soup. I mean, God, Glenrothes and its history with sherry to me is just, it's so checkered. And this
Mhm.
isn't flawed, it's just weird.
It's almost like I had one of those Manhattans at a bar where they do the live smoking, where they've got a piece of a barrel and they put some smoke on top of it, and there's a slight, almost astringent note to it. I don't know how else to describe it.
And for some reason, they made it with Bren instead of like a decent whiskey because it's trendy. All right, I'm gonna fire up the poll here. Doug, I don't know if you've put thought into or if you've selected your three favorite drams. But I'm gonna fire up the poll so people have a few minutes to vote here. While they're voting, Doug, if you had to choose three drams tonight, which would they be?
Well, definitely the 31-year-old Macbeth. Not only did it get everybody super feisty in the comments,
Mm,
I also think it's just absolutely stunning. The Scotch Malt Whiskey Society would be my number two. I'm super excited to see when it comes out later this year. I think it's an absolutely lovely one, and the fact that we're only on the 53rd cask from Glengarry when it was the 19th distillery is kind of fascinating to me.
mhm.
There's a piece of me that wants to pick the Whiskey Sponge 91, which I think was actually quite lovely, but I'm gonna go and actually say the fourth chapter, the 18-year-old. I think it was one of those ones where it's a lovely value for money, very, very crushable. I could sit around a fire with some friends and polish off the bottle without too much trouble. So, what about yourself?
I like it. Uh, very similar but different. Uh, the Macbeth for sure. I think cleans the floor. Uh, I mean, it to me for that one, it's not even close. Second favorite for me, I'm gonna go with the sponge though. I love that really old style. I love it when I'm tasting something that is immediate. It's immediately apparent that this is something really old.
Yeah.
Uh, and then I also am gonna go with Chapter 4, Glengarry 18. That is my third pick because I think it's good value. Nothing against the society balling. I think it's a great dram. Um, I really like the structure of that 18. And I also think the bottling strength, everything just seems to work perfectly. So those are my three favorites. I see you let Noel back in. He appears to be in there twice. I don't know if he's trying to skew the vote. Um, it could be. I'm going to check on the poll here. So four of you have yet to vote. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to make your selections and vote, and then we're going to call it. Um, Doug, anything else in the world of whiskey interesting to you these days?
You know what? I think it's such a fascinating time right now in general. I just got back from Spirit of Space side. I mean, it's there's so much new stuff coming down the pipe, lots of new distilleries starting to hit the shelves, lots of people sort of talking about stuff and trying to experiment a lot more. We've got a little bit of a wood shortage going on in Scotland right now, so especially some of the larger distilleries and brands are getting a bit more creative. And I think at the end of the day, it's all going to really benefit the consumer. So super excited to see what it's like over the next little while.
There's comment here. Jeff is suggesting that the Knowles and Shannons are trying to rig the vote. At least that's what I'm reading from the comments. Doug, one of the other things you mentioned that was a bit shocking is that a large part of the industry has quietly just shuttered production this
Yes.
year. I mean, you and I have talked a little bit about this. Last year, I think the numbers were that the industry made 8 times as much liquid as it bottled, which certainly in a long-term trend is not a good one. Suggests there was a fair bit of overproduction, which certain people chicken littling it have been, suggesting this might be a concern for a few years on. But a lot of the big guys aren't even making at some of the iconic distilleries right now.
Yeah, it's super sad. About a quarter, from what I could gather, about a quarter of Diageo's distilleries are currently not producing, and a bunch of others are ramping down. And we've seen a big drop in the total number of bottles leaving Scotland. We've seen a slight uptick in the total value, only because I think we've seen some price increases, but I think things are very much stabilizing. And again, I think consumers are going to be the winners at the end of the day in the coming months and years as we see things stabilize a little bit, and brands, especially some of those that have been super popular, and ones that you've had a horrible time going through balloting systems for and other things, stabilize and realize that they're going to have to do a little bit of work to get our attention, which is wonderful.
It's funny because companies that I've not seen someone from in 10 years have started showing up at the store. Like, hey, how can we work together? And it's like, hey, where have you been for the last 12 years? Uh, like they just took for granted that things would sell and they didn't have to try. And I mean, on one level, I'm kind of excited about the path ahead because I think the most fun part for me of whiskey is like romancing people on it, talking about it. I'm terrible about this in the shop because I'm just not available. I'm never around. I'm always working on things. But on those few occasions when people come in and I get to talk to them about things and tell them why they're cool, like you remember how much fun that is. And I think a lot of that side of the industry took a back seat to this like desperate rush to buy shit over the last 10 years, which while at times might have been lucrative for the business, wasn't always fun. The Springbank thing though, Doug, like I don't see any path out of that because like, we just got some Springbanks in and like the odds on some of them were 1 in 30. Like, so I mean, it's going to take a long time for some of that to get adjusted, if it ever does. But I think, you know, we're at such a weird time, like where McAllen has got, you can't go there unless you're like you've paid for an overpriced tour, but Cirque du Soleil is there. Otherwise, you can't even enter the property. But on the other hand, you've got other companies, include especially Diageo, who all of a sudden are like, oh shit, we've got to try. We can't, we've actually got to put effort in and work with the people that are selling our stuff. So could be an interesting couple of years, but I mean, I'm looking forward to it because I think there's going to be some good opportunities that come out of it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think some of the smaller family-owned distilleries are going to continue to benefit because they've worked very, very hard. I mean, some of my favorite tours over there were at Benromick, at Glenfarclas, and some of my least favorite were at some of the larger, more conglomerate-like distilleries. So
What?
we're in
Shocking.
for a good time. So
So I'm going to end the polls here. Someone's left, and there's still someone who hasn't voted. But in the voting for top whiskey tonight, this is a stunner. It's a tie between the Whiskey Sponge and the Macbeth. I thought for sure that Macbeth was like the clear favorite, but nice to see that. And a tie between the Society bottle and the Renaissance. Round two, second favorite. Look at that. Society bottle storms to the front. So the people have spoken. They like their cast strength. Uh, they like their casting strengths. Evan did ask a cheeky third question here. Which is better if you had to choose, Glen Garioch or Glenrothes? 100% of the votes for Glen Garioch. Can't say I'm surprised. So there are the results. I'll share them for a moment if everyone wants to do it. And yes, Jeff, when I threaten 30 seconds left to vote and go down a rabbit hole, it rarely lasts just 30 seconds. Doug, anything you want to add before we wrap this one up?
no, I think, a couple things just very, very quickly. Thank you to you for putting together an excellent lineup. I think this showed very, very well for Glengarry. Thank you to my children and wife who went from 3 devices down to 1. So I feel like my internet connection stabilized a little bit. And thank you to Sam and Jeff for not taking the piss out of me too much tonight.
Yeah. Well, Doug, thanks for being my co-pilot on this tonight, adding some great color. Also, thank you to your wife and children for limiting minions to just one device. That definitely did help. Thanks everybody for tuning into tonight's tasting. I hope you enjoyed it. We've got lots of other great ones. We'll still be doing some of these over the summer. We might slow it down a little bit, but we have a lot of fun with these. We appreciate that you come along for the ride with us on them. I hope you're entertained and that you enjoy the drams, and sorry about the one Glenrothes. We had to put it in there. Anyway, everyone, thanks a lot. Have a good night. Thanks, Doug.
Thanks all.